The following podcast contains information and real stories about sexual assault and or violence which may be triggering to survivors.
From sporting
in the morning newspapers, a third allegation of sexual assault. By afternoon,
had to
a
fight to
fourth.
share her story of sexual abuse.
Bravery and the strength of Grace Tame.
Another
and
former
people like
staffer
her.
alleging the man had run his hand up her thigh in a
haven't
cattle
seen
bar.
this process of child grooming.
After a rape allegation and a question-time sex scandal.
Woman who bled heavily.
In 2016, the Australian Bureau of Statistics estimated that 1 in 6 women and 1 in 16 men have experienced some form of sexual crime since the age of 15. On top of that, most major studies indicate that 25% of young women between ages of 15 and 21 will experience some form of sexual crime within that 6-year time frame. This is far too high. In a time where the world is changing so fast, sexual crimes seem to be regularly dominating the news, which begs the question, why is this and how can we help prevent it? I'm your host, Byron, a 22-year-old podcaster from Sydney, Australia. Join me as I interview Brent, one of Australia's most respected communicators in the field of sexual crime, criminal profiling and personal safety in secondary schools and universities. He may have been to your school. Having spoken to over 900,000 students on the subject, this podcast aims to educate young people around the reality of sexual crimes and the severity of these crimes. Together, we explore the legal definitions as well as the ethical and moral, wrapping these up in metaphors and stories in an easy to listen to and easy to understand way. Welcome to this episode. Welcome back to the podcast. This episode is going to be around age. We're going to be talking about what the law says and everything we need to know when it comes to age involved with sexual crimes. So to start off, why do we have this rule in the first place? Like, why do we have an age?
Yeah, look, age of consent comes up a little bit in my talks, and it particularly comes up from students who are around that age, 15 or 16. Look, the reason we have an age of consent primarily is to enable the law to prosecute adults who exploit children. Okay, so that's why we have an age of consent law. Now, age of consent in most states and territories in Australia is 16. There are 2 states where it's 17, Tasmania and South Australia. All other states.
And again, if you're an international listener, you've got to figure out what.
Yeah,
what
it is. It can be different, but it's around about that 16, 17 age in most Western countries. So if we look at say 16 as being the age as a age of consent, what the law basically says is up to age 16 you can be classified as a child sexually. Over 16, so once you've celebrated your 16th birthday, you are classified as a sexual adult. Straight away, the confusion here can kick in because, well, I thought you weren't an adult until you're 18. So you're legally an adult at 18 with regards to crimes and being sent to prison, all those big end things, voting, all those type of things. But an adult with regards to consent law in New South Wales is, in most states, is 16. So we have this age of consent, 16. Now, the reason it's there is, for example, terrible situations like, for example, if you worked in the child protection unit of the police, you're often dealing with older offenders, pedophiles, who target young children for sexual exchange, sexual intimacy. And these children can be so young, they have absolutely no idea what it is that they're taking part in. So any civilised law would agree we couldn't ever say, oh, those children are consenting, so we can't charge this pedophile.
Because they lack the maturity.
Yeah, so up to 16, you're classified as a child. Now, the application of age of consent law is going to be totally different if, for example, we have a 16-year-old with a 15-year-old. That's not really what that law is there for. So if we had, as an example, a young person who was 15 going out with a young person who was 16, technically one has become a sexual adult and one is still a sexual child. But their ages are very close together. So generally the rule of the police or the law would be if the 15 and 16-year-old are engaging in intimate exchange and they're both fine with it, they're both totally okay with it, they could be in a relationship, whatever the case may be, this is not a policing matter. The police would say that is a matter for parents to deal with. Now, if we start pushing those ages out, as with any law, the further the ages are apart, the more closely it will be looked at by the law. It's a bit like a comparison. is, it may seem like a strange one, but all laws have the same principle. It's like speed limits. If you exceed a 50 kilometre an hour speed limit by a couple of kilometres an hour, even if the police were to clock you doing that, nothing really is going to happen, because the laws that apply and the penalties that apply to exceeding the speed limit don't really kick in until you've exceeded it by 5 to 10 kilometres an hour. Now, the more I exceed the speed limit by, the greater the consequences are going to be for me and the more serious it becomes. Age of consent has a similar principle. Age of consent 16. But if we had a 15 and a 16-year-old engage in intimate exchange, they're both fine with it, they're both totally okay with it. This is not something that the police are going to rush in and send people to court. This is something that the parents can chat to the children about. If you push those ages out and say, okay, what if we've got someone who's 18 with someone who's 14? Well, now we have 4 years difference in age, and when both parties are at the age group that they are,
middle of puberty.
Yeah, that's a massive difference. So to run the metaphor, the comparison, that would be like the difference between exceeding a 50k speed limit by 2 to 3 kilometres an hour versus exceeding it by 20 to 25 kilometres an hour. So the greater the ages are, the difference in age, the more likely it is that the age of consent laws would be applied. The other thing that comes up quite a bit in my talks, Byron, is, and often when I'm talking to year 10s, I'll say, what if both people are under 16? And it's a really valid question. So say, as an example, you had two 15-year-olds who came together and were having an intimate exchange. Let's say that they're at the house of one of them. Parents come home unexpectedly, freak out, call the police and say, look, my child is only 15. I've caught this other person having intercourse with them. My child is underage. I want this other person charged. The job for the police there, and I've actually been in a situation not too dissimilar to this, is we would ask both the people involved, okay, how old are you? Now, let's say they're both 15. Well, we would check that, confirm it. That takes about 10 seconds.
Yeah.
So we've confirmed that we have two 15-year-olds involved in this exchange. The next thing that we would generally, or the police would generally do, is separate the two children, sit them down and have a talk to them. And as we're talking to them, the police would be wanting to establish, did this 15-year-old and this 15-year-old freely allow each other to take part in this intimate exchange? If they did, they were both totally fine with it. The position of the police, in my experience, would be, this is a matter for parents. This is not a policing matter. This is not what the age of consent laws are set up to deal with. Okay? Now, just to cover all bases here, because we know on your podcast, Byron, that people do love to enter into a legal debate, and that's fantastic.
But what if?
Yeah, that's fantastic. So let's cover this. What if the police have that discussion with two 15-year-olds, and their view is that clearly, at this point, they believe one of the 15-year-olds imposed themselves intimately on the other, where the other was clearly not wanting that to occur. Well, now, under law, the police could look to possibly charge that 15-year-old with whatever it is that they have done. So we have two 15-year-olds who come together. If they're both totally fine with it, they're giving each other permission, the police view would generally be, this is a matter for parents to deal with. If two 15-year-olds come together and one imposes themselves intimately on the other without that person wanting them to, that 15-year-old could be charged with whatever it is that they've done, because it's an unwanted intimate exchange. You can be charged with a criminal offence under Australian law over the age of 10.
Wow, okay.
Over the age of 14, between 10 and 14, we would generally need to show that the offender knew the crime that they were committing. Over 14, you don't have to really establish that. So you could technically have a situation where a 15-year-old could be charged with committing a sexual crime. Now, it's not common, but it could occur under law. The other thing that comes up is, okay, what if they're both under 16, but say one was 15, but the other one was quite a bit younger, say more than 2 years younger. Well, now they're both under 16, but we have more than, say, a 2 years difference in age. The police could look at that through the Child Protection Unit to possibly look to charge an older child with the sexual exploitation of a much younger child. So there could be a situation there where something could occur.
Which links into like the power dynamic we kind of mentioned earlier.
All that.
Yeah.
Look, laws are written down black and white. They appear black and white on a page, but their application comes in different shades. So yes, age of consent is 16. But as we can see through our discussion here, Byron, there's a lot of different circumstances which technically cross that line that will be dealt with quite differently, because when we come back to the spirit of age of consent law, it is there to protect children from being sexually exploited by adults. It's not there to charge young people of similar age who do things intimately that they both want to do.
And they got caught by their parents.
Now, we could argue in a different discussion, yes, but morally and ethically, is it, should we be encouraging 15-year-olds to engage in intimacy?
Right.
Well, I'm not saying that. I'm saying from a legal perspective, and this is what we're discussing, the police can't arrest somebody just because of a moral, they've crossed what others would say is a moral or ethical issue. The police would say there is no law that's been broken here, in our view, so therefore this is a matter for parents to look into.
Yeah. And just to clarify, so like 18 to 17, there's nothing really wrong there because adults
and good on you. That's a really good point, actually, Byron. There's a bit of confusion around this. Often what comes up in my talks is, okay, so age of consent is 16. And then people often say to me, I've heard that if you turn 16, the law says that you can only engage in intimate exchange with someone who's under 18.
Right. So you've got a 2-year window.
Yeah. Well, as you know, if those of you that have listened to the other consent podcasts that we've done, sometimes myths can be surrounded because they hold a little bit of truth.
Yeah.
And there is an element of truth in that, but it's a very small element. What the law says is this: once you turn 16, you're a sexual adult. And if you choose to, you are entitled legally to engage in sexual activity consensually with another sexual adult. That is another person over 16. So what if someone's 17? So they're a sexual adult legally in this state, and they are, say, engaging in a sexual activity with somebody who's 21 or 22. From a purely legal perspective, we have two sexual adults. One is 17, one is 22. They are both over the age of 16. However, off to the side, we have this other law that says that there are certain people who are prohibited under law to engage in intimate exchange with other people, even if those other people have turned 16. Okay, so these are people who are deemed legally to be in a position of power or control over those people. So some of the obvious ones, I'll give you an example, would be, say, for example, a teacher.
This is whole Jeffrey Epstein, isn't it? Because he was in a position of power and he had girls who were from high schools, like 17.
Yeah. Look, it could be an easier way to get your head around it is to say, if, let's say, a 17-year-old was engaged in intimate exchange with a 22 or 23-year-old, is that an offence if they're both consenting? It's only an offence if the person over 18 is legally in a position of care and control of the person who's under 18. So teachers, counsellors, tutors, sporting coaches, they would come under that category. So as an example, it's not the only one, 17-year-old student having a sexual relationship with a 23-year-old who is a teacher at their school. The 17-year-old is over age of consent, but the teacher is in a position of care and control. Teacher could be charged. And the charge is unlawful sexual connection with a child under your care and control.
Right.
Okay. Could be a sporting coach. Could be a tutor, a counsellor.
The Jeffrey Epstein one was a bad example then, because he wasn't actually in their control.
Yeah. He wouldn't technically under Australian law, the Epstein thing. He's older. There's a power and control issue there, which would bring into question: did the person freely consent?
Right.
What we're talking about is when a person between 16 and 18 engages in intimate exchange with somebody over 18. Is that lawful? Is it unlawful? If they're both consenting, it's fine, unless the person over 18 falls into the legal category of being in a position of care or control. The one that you most commonly hear in the media in Australia are teachers. Yeah. Teachers who have entered into intimate relationships, intimate exchanges with students in the schools where they teach.
So that's interesting because I thought if you're over the age of 18, you couldn't have a relation with a 17-year-old or something. You can legally unless you're in position of care. Correct. Because we see the teacher examples or other examples and they get charged, so we must go, because they're underage.
Yes. No, it's because of that relationship between the person over 18 and the one between 16 and 18.
Wow.
So if you had a 17-year-old going out with a 19-year-old, right?
Totally fine.
Totally fine. Both consenting, totally fine. Unless the 19-year-old
was in
a tutor, sporting coach, teacher, something such as that.
And then you mentioned if they're like, say they're 35 or something, does that change, or is it still?
Well, it changes morally and ethically,
Yes,
definitely,
morally and
and because of that, it puts perhaps a larger magnifying glass or microscope on it. So, look, there was a case many years ago, and I won't name too many names. It was a school that I was going into where a young girl moved out of home when she was 16, which you're quite legally entitled to do, and she moved in with a male teacher from her school. Now, morally and ethically, I think most of us would have an issue with that.
Yes, for sure.
Right? Her parents at the time, I'm not speaking out of school here, it's a coin of phrase, this was in the papers, it was a school that I was actually working in. Parents, understandably, and I'm a parent myself, were less than comfortable about their daughter at 16 now living in the home of a male teacher on his own with this girl. The teacher was in their mid-30s.
Wow.
So the parents contacted the school notified the education department, and also the police got involved. Now, when the police got involved, the police investigation found that there was no evidence to show that the 16-year-old girl was in an intimate relationship with let's say it was a 35-year-old teacher. So morally and ethically, we've got an issue here, but legally, the police are saying our hands are tied. That he's not breaking the law, allowing a young girl at 16 to live with him. If there was proof that there was an intimate exchange there, now they can charge him for that.
Really? Even though she's over the age of 16?
Yes, because we go back to him being in a position of care and control.
Teacher.
He's a teacher,
Right.
Teacher. Come on, Byron, keep up.
Sorry.
No, see how confusing this can get?
It gets very confusing.
So the police view on this was, 16-year-old girl, old enough to leave home, no law being broken. 16-year-old girl living with 35-year-old teacher from her school. Dodgy. Morally and ethically, yes, but we can't charge him with being dodgy and immoral and unethical. So the police view was there's no evidence at this stage. The girl's saying we're not in a relationship. Nothing they could do. Interestingly, in this case, the education department stepped in and they deemed that was in breach of their code of conduct, his code of employment, and he in fact lost his job.
Good.
Right? Interestingly, many years later, when that young woman was quite a bit older, she came out and actually stated that they were in an intimate relationship. Now, at that stage, because she's an adult herself, it would have to be her that goes to the police to lay charges. And to the best of my knowledge, she chose not to do that. So, at the time of the investigation, there was no evidence, and she certainly didn't go to the police and disclose that there was an intimate relationship. So the police couldn't take action. But interestingly, in that scenario, because morally and ethically he had put himself in breach of the Education Department Code of Conduct, he was removed from the school. In fact, I think he wasn't able to practice as a teacher.
Makes sense. And look, this might be going into too details, but let's say this guy lost his job.
Yes.
He's now no longer a teacher.
Yes.
Are they able to have sexual relationships?
That's a really good question. And again, because these are questions that folks listening into your podcast are going to ask. Now he's no longer a teacher of that student. He would not be seen to be a person that is under where that person is under his care or control. So he couldn't be charged with that offence. Case in Sydney in the last couple of years, a school teacher was charged with having unlawful sexual connection with students. And I think, don't quote me on this, I think there were 4 different students that he was charged with.
Wow.
All the students were over the age of 16, but he was their teacher. Now, in one of those occasions, he had been the teacher of one of those young people, but had moved to another school, then had the relationship when he was a teacher, but not in the school where that student was a pupil.
Yeah.
Now, the judge in that particular case deemed that although he is a teacher by profession, he's not in a position of care and control of that particular student. So that charge didn't stand up. But the other 3 did, because in the other 3, he engaged in intimate exchange with students at the school where he was teaching. He was working and they were students. So there is a point where the law would draw a line and say, once you cross over that line, the law would say there's no longer that position of care and control.
Yeah.
So using teachers as an example, this is not having a go at teachers.
No,
I'm sure we've got a few listening in going, whoa.
Yeah.
It's just an easy analogy for people to get their head around.
It applies to coach anyone who's tutors, everything you mentioned before.
Yeah. If you're a coach and you're 22, you, by definition, are in care and control of those that you coach. But that doesn't prohibit you from having an intimate exchange with somebody who's of legal age, but they're not under your care and control. So it's not so much down to your profession per se, but it's whether your profession puts you in care and control of that person that you're having the intimate exchange with.
And like, once again, I don't know if this is getting into too much detail.
That's
This is
okay.
probably overkill, but this is very fascinating to me. If there's a 25-year-old coach and he's training, let's say, women's netball or something, and there's a 22-year-old girl and they fancy each other and they get into a relationship.
No problem. The issue is when you have two people, one's a coach and one is being coached by them, and the coach is over 18 and the person being coached is between 16 and 18.
Yeah, gotcha.
Now, if the person being coached is under 16, then it's black and white, isn't it?
Yes.
Because it's like it's a child.
Yeah.
So that's a criminal offence. That would be unlawful sexual connection with a child. If the person between 16 and 18, it becomes a slightly different offence. It's engaging in an unlawful sexual exchange with a person under your care and control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, this all stemmed from the 17 to 18 because I thought there was that 16 to 17 was that kind of grey area. We're like, well, what are we allowed? What are people allowed to do there?
Yeah.
And so that gives a lot of clarity.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, it is. So in conclusion, once you hit 16, you're a sexual adult, and technically you can't engage in intimate exchange with somebody under 16. But as we go back to our examples, the closer those ages are, the less likely it is that the police would take action. The further those ages push apart, the more. So when both parties are over 16, they're both consenting, no problem, unless we have that narrow band of situations where it's an intimate exchange with somebody in a position of care and control versus somebody who's under their care and control. Then we can have that issue.
Perfect.
Yeah. All right.
Well, are there any final thoughts when it comes to age you wanted to clarify?
I think that pretty much from. I'm just trying to think of the questions and queries that I get, which I think we've pretty much covered. Look, one thing I would say, of course, to older folks listening in who are over age of consent, morally, ethically, and of course also legally, we draw a line with people who are over 16, knowingly having sexual contact with somebody who's under 16. Now, this brings up one other point. This comes up often in my talks. What about if a 15-year-old who's under age of consent gets hold of, now let's use, just for sake of illustration, let's use a young woman who's 15, doesn't have to be. The law is not gender specific. There's no mention of gender in age of consent. But just as an example, this one sometimes comes up. What if a 15-year-old girl gets hold of her older sister's ID, who's 18,
oh, yes, good one.
And gains entry into a licensed premises, onto a pub. So you've got to be 18 to get in. And she looks 18. She looks like her older sister.
Don't they? 15-year-olds look 18 nowadays.
They can do. So let's say this young 15-year-old girl goes into a licensed premises. There's a guy on the door who checks her ID, looks at the ID. Yep, she looks just like her sister. Boom, and you go. So a 15-year-old is now in a licensed premises where you've got to be 18 to get in. She has shown proof of being 18, even though she's not. She looks like she's 18 or over. And it's unlikely that she would tell people in the licensed premises that she's in year 10.
Of course not.
So let's say, hypothetically, that young girl meets an 18-year-old guy in there, 18 or 19-year-old guy.
Who's going to assume, because she's in the premise, that she has to be at least 18.
So she meets him. They're getting on really well. She lies to him about her age. She says she's just finished year 12 or whatever the case may be. Then let's say, just for the sake of our analogy, they go back to her place at her invitation and they engage in sexual intercourse that she's quite okay with. The girl's mum or dad walks in and catches them. They know that the girl is only 15. She's brought this guy home who's having sex with her. They're freaking out, right? Ask, how old are you? He's 18. The parents are going, well, my daughter's in year 10. He's going, well, hang on. Yeah. I met her at the pub. So let's say the police get called. Police arrive at the scene. Using pure numbers, we've got an issue here, haven't we? 15-year-old, underage consent, 18-year-old, 3 years difference in age. We're getting to a point where technically, okay, we've got to look at this. Then, as with all police investigations, they're not black and white. They come in different shades. Okay, what are the circumstances behind this? Once the police discover that this young girl used false ID to get into licensed premises, under any reasonable test, she looks to be 18. She told the boy she was 18. Then the question is, was it reasonable for him to assume that she was over 16?
Mm.
Yes, because of where they met, how she presented, what she said. Under those circumstances, he couldn't be charged with knowingly having an unlawful interaction with somebody under the age of 16.
Because she's actually done coercion and manipulation there.
Well, yeah, she has created a situation where it is reasonable for the guy to assume that she was of legal age to provide consent. And when we look at somebody who's over 16 who engages in intimate exchange with somebody under 16, when you look at the wording of the law, in amongst it, we have to show in court that it was reasonable for the older person to assume that the younger person was under legal age of consent. Now, clearly in our example here, and of course, Byron, it's not the only example, but it's one that serves to illustrate how different circumstances can lead to different legal conclusions. The legal conclusion there would be, yes, the girl is under age of consent, she's 15. Yes, the boy is 18. However, under the circumstances of where they met, how they met, it was more than reasonable for him to assume that she was of legal age of consent, so he couldn't be charged under those circumstances. So that's another little curly aspect of age of consent law, and it is one that comes up quite a bit in my talks.
Oh, it makes sense.
And with the application of all laws, Byron, that term reasonable comes in on both sides. The term reasonable is one of the most used terms in the Crimes Act. You know, if you're charged, or you and I are charged with a criminal offence, we have to be proved guilty beyond reasonable doubt. Self-defence is force which is reasonable. All these things. So whenever we're looking at a law, we have to apply that term reasonable. So using our little example there, that would fail the reasonable test in so much as it was unreasonable for him to know what her actual age was if she presented herself in a licensed premises as being over that age.
I have a final question, which could be silly, but
that's okay.
I think it's very relevant in today's world, which is of online dating. If let's say a 21-year-old guy is talking to a 15-year-old girl on social media, they've never met up, maybe they've flirted over text or stuff, or maybe she sent some pictures or something. Or what's happening there?
Yeah, again, what would come into play there is, was it reasonable for the 21-year-old guy to be aware of how old this person was?
Let's say he knows.
If he knows,
you would assume,
we've got an issue here. And the issue that we have here is if the 21-year-old is being seen in any way to be grooming the 15-year-old towards sexual activity or something. You mentioned also, Byron, say the 21-year-old gets the 15-year-old to send naked images. That's a criminal offence.
It's child pornography, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Under Australian law, it's unlawful to be in possession of a naked image of a person who's under the age of 18.
Maybe we should do a whole episode on this topic.
Yeah, we might touch on that one as well. Even if that person, even if that girl, let's say, using that as the example, and I stress again that these laws are not gender
specific. Could be guy-girl, could be guy-guy, girl-girl,
if we've got a 21-year-old who is online with a 15-year-old, and they know that this person is 15, and the 21-year-old starts entering into discussions around sexual stuff, or can you send me some nudes and stuff such as that, this is an offence. And even if that 15-year-old is quite happy to send those images, the law is quite clear on this. The law states that 21-year-old is now in possession of naked images of a person under 18. Now, I know the ages get confusing here, Brian. It's easy for me because I do this all the time.
Yeah, but
we've
for
got
the everyday
16
person,
age of consent, we've got 18 for naked images and things, but it is what it is, and I can only relay what the law says. So that you used the term before, and you're quite right. That would be eliciting child pornography in that instance, and that guy could be facing some very, very serious charges. If we go back to our little example before, if the 15-year-old pitched herself as being 18 or 19, said that she was, presented evidence that she was, and it was reasonable for him to assume that she was over 18. Well, now we've got a very similar scenario to the scenario that we use with a young person in a pub.
And that's like Tinder, right? It's the exact same. You have to be 18 to be on Tinder. And so if you're meeting someone on Tinder, you have to assume that they're over the age of 18.
That's right. There's an interesting little twist in the tale there. When we're looking at mistaken age of identity and stuff like that, it only applies if age of consent's 16. That mistaken age of identity, meaning I mistakenly thought that they were over 16, only applies to somebody who's over the age of 14. You can't use that defence in most states. So using our example earlier again, 15-year-old goes into a pub and presents as being 18. The defence that would prevent that case from going to court basically is that mistaken age of identity.
Whereas if they're 12, they should clearly look like they're not 18.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So mistaken age of identity is an offence, meaning it was quite reasonable to assume that this person was over age of 16. Can only be applied in circumstances where the person that we're talking about is over the age of 14. So does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Lots of ages, and people listening to the podcast might have to rewind it and listen again because, but this is the law, and this is why we have these discussions, because people listening in are people who want information, and it's important that they get the right information. Yep, it can be a little confusing, but once you get your head around it, there is a pattern there. Right, I can see how this all falls into place.
No, I've got a pretty good understanding of it now, I think, after this 30 minutes. Hopefully the listeners do. If not, they can go listen to it again.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
So that's the whole point. But I think it covered pretty much everything in terms of age.
I think we've got that one down pat.
Awesome. All right, well, we'll move on to the next episode.
All right.
Thanks for joining me.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much for making it all the way through this episode. After hearing the contents of this podcast, many may realize the sad reality of what has happened to them. If this is you and you seek help or guidance on what to do next, please click the link in the show notes. It'll redirect you to some resources as well as a helpline if you want to talk to someone anonymous. As you'll hear in other episodes, Brent and I do mention how important it is to start talking to someone, whether that's a family member, a friend, or it could be someone anonymous on a helpline. They are trained professionals, and we highly recommend you start this conversation. As you'll hear as well, in no way do you have to report this crime. This is completely up to you, but know that there are resources and links provided in the show notes below should you seek guidance.